So the reason I'm showing you this slide, this is you probably can guess, this is a screenshot of my Google Scholar. Apart from showing how well I've aged, that's a bit of an out of date photo. There are two things I want you to take away from that slide. The first is that a career as a qualitative researcher is not going to get you millions of citations. That's my most highly cited output. And it's not huge. You know, if you're a clinical researcher, you'll have much higher citation rates than that. But the other reason I put it up there is because the context in which that open letter was written by Trish Greenash and a load of us colleagues, round about the BMJ actually always published quite a lot of qualitative research. In the early 2000s, they had a really nice series by Kathy Pope and Nick Mays about what constitutes good qualitative research. And then round about the mid-2010s, qualitative researchers started getting rejection letters from the BMJ that didn't specifically say, you know, your study's no good or we don't like your paper, that said we no longer prioritise qualitative research. And we thought, what's going on here? So Trish orchestrated a very, very good letter about, you know, saying why that's a mistake. And the BMJ responded with an editorial. And it's really interesting that this is just a chunk from their editorial. And it's really interesting that if you read through the things that they say, this is what we do, and their implication is this is the thing, this qualitative research is none of these things. So we only publish things that are relevant to an international audience. So qualitative research isn't. Things that are likely to change clinical practice. Qualitative papers don't do that. We don't prioritise qualitative research because it's exploratory and it doesn't provide generalisable answers. So they're obviously wrong. And not as widely cited, and I'll come back to that one. So they're obviously wrong. But are we beyond reproach? And can we really say that all of the qualitative research that we do and that gets sent out there is really excellent? And I think we probably need to be a little bit more self-critical. And so one of the things, so I do a lot of reviewing of qualitative papers, probably not as much as Ewan would like, but you know, I do my share, I think. But one of the things that always makes me pause when I'm looking at a qualitative paper is when somebody says, and these are the themes which emerged. They describe a problem, they describe some methods, and then they say, these are the themes which emerged from my data. And this is a lovely paper, an editorial written by Lisa Morris, who's one of the editors. She's actually from Lancaster. I don't know if you know her. She's an editor of the journal Qualitative Social Work, and she wrote this very nice, last year, she wrote this very nice editorial about why themes do not emerge. Themes are generated by researchers, by particular researchers in particular ways. And that is it worries me that I think that the number of times I see that in a qualitative paper, these were the themes which emerged. So I think that, yes, the BMJ is clearly wrong, but I do think that we could do better. And I think what I want to talk about today is how we can use theory to do better and why theory matters. And we'll come back at the end to the big thing that I think theory allows us to do, and that's generalise. And that's be able to make contributions which are relevant way beyond the particular context in which we collect our qualitative data. So why don't themes emerge? To paraphrase Bill Clinton, it's the theory, stupid. But of course, when you start thinking about the use of theory in qualitative research, it starts to get really murky and complicated. These are just a few definitions of theory that I picked out of the Oxford English Dictionary. And there are many, many different ways that you can think about the use of theory in qualitative research. And I don't like it when people say this is how you have to do it. And so what I'm going to try to do today is just give you a sketch of some of the ways that theory gets used and how it can enhance and help our work. So I'm going to talk about three types of theory. I'm going to talk about what I call high theory, which is the dreaded ontology and epistemology. So for those of you who are PhD students in the audience, sorry, You can't get away from it. You've got to do ontology and epistemology. And then I'm going to talk about theoretical frameworks, and that's the area in which, personally I have in the past struggled somewhat, because I think, what is a theoretical framework? What's not a theoretical framework? And it's actually, preparing this talk has been really good, because it's made me sit down and think a little bit about what do I actually mean when I talk about using a theoretical framework. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about something where many of you will have potentially used theory in a more focused way. And I've called those explanatory theories, which I think are probably a special case of theoretical frameworks. I see theoretical frameworks as being very broad, and like a skeleton and a framework, whereas explanatory theories are where you've decided which theory you want to use and then you apply it in a very specific way. And I'm going to talk about each of those in turn. So, high theory, ontology and epistemology. I first came across this when I was doing my master's in a department of sociology, and my first thought was, oh my God. But actually it's really simple. Ontology is what do I think is the nature of the world. Epistemology is what counts as knowledge about that world. A methodology is how do I go about finding out about that world. And I think we do ourselves a disservice very often because we conflate methods and methodology, and they are not the same. Methods are the nitty-gritty, the how do you do it. The methodology is that link between your ontology, your epistemology, and the methods that you use. So again, this is where there's going to be there's the potential for the sociologists to start pulling me apart here. But I'm just going to give you a sketch of kind of three, if you like, extremes or different ways of thinking about ontology. And many of you, and me as a GP, I was trained in a positivist ontology. The real world's out there. I need to be as neutral and objective as possible in finding out about the world, to find the truth, or if you're a Popperian, to be able to falsify what's out there in the world. And the really important thing for a positivist is that you've got to reduce bias, and you've got to avoid the subjectivity of the observer affecting what goes on in the world. Constructivist ontology, sometimes called interpretivist, is probably almost the polar opposite of that, and has its own problems because it's quite possible for a constructivist ontology to dissolve into a really unhelpful relativism where you can't know anything about anything, and you become a postmodern blob sitting on the floor because you can't know anything, and therefore why are we bothering? That doesn't mean it's not helpful, and I think it is, and actually most of what I do I would say probably comes from a constructivist position. And essentially what the constructivists would say is that the observers and the observed are together creating the findings of the research. And the really crucial insight, and I think this really is true, and I think this is where the positivists really need to think about what they're doing, is there is no such thing as an unbiased observer, and you cannot get rid of bias, and you cannot become this kind of neutral, flat thing that has no influence on what's going on around you. And that subjectivity is important and useful, and you can use your subjectivity. So one of the things I always say to students is qualitative research is really creative because you're using every part of yourself in generating your findings. Critical realist ontology. My sister's a critical realist, and she'd probably say I'm caricaturing it, and that's wrong. But essentially, what the critical realists say, or sometimes called subtle realists, there is a real world, but you can't actually know anything about it other than through your human subjectivity. And the key sort of insight of a critical realist approach is that there are multiple layers. And at the bottom, you have these underlying causal mechanisms, which you can't observe. But what you can do, if you do your research in the right way and following the right tenets, you can deduce some things about those underlying causal mechanisms. So, why does all this matter? The point is that all of us have an ontology and epistemology. And there's a joke that goes around in sociology circles, which is if somebody thinks they don't have an ontology and epistemology, then they're a positivist. And sociologists have been known to use positivist as a term of abuse. Now, that's obviously wrong. But But I'm going to give you an example from a colleague who has given me permission to share this. So this colleague did some focus group, was doing a master's in public health, did some focus groups with professional colleagues, and was working from a positivist paradigm with a positivist supervisor. She did some focus groups, and in one of the focus groups, she kind of let slip her neutral observer mask and really engaged and shared stories and engaged with and got some really rich insights from the focus group, the focus group participants. When she went back to her positivist supervisor, he said, "Whoa, you've got to discard all that data. You weren't a neutral observer. That data's got to go." Later on, doing a PhD, came back to that work and thought, well, I'll do a secondary analysis of these focus groups because it's really interesting data. By that time, thinking of it from a more a different ontological perspective, and suddenly thought, hang on a minute, those data are really interesting and really important, and you can't, discarding them is mad because they give some of the most important insights into what was going on. And so what that illustrates is the fact that ontology and epistemology matter because they're the things that tell you what constitutes valid data. So for the positivist, that section of the focus group wasn't valid data. For the constructivist or the interpretivist, that's the best data you've got. And so you can't not have an ontology and epistemology because it determines what you think your data is about and what constitutes data. So, with that in mind, you have an ontology, you have an epistemology, whether you think you do or you don't. Talk about theoretical frameworks. I found this really lovely paper in the International Journal of Qualitative Methods by Collins and Stockton, and they found this really nice diagram of the kind of use of theory in qualitative research. Now, I would quarrel with some of we'll come back to how I think their diagram could be improved. But the thing I like about this is the fact that they start with the problem, the puzzle, the hook, and then they talk about literature buckets, and I love that because I think that I was just telling you earlier, the proudest boast of my academic career is the fact that I've never done a systematic review, and I never intend to do one. But I think I love the idea of literature buckets because whenever you've got a problem, there are multiple different buckets of literature that might be relevant to that problem. And the first thing you do is you start looking at them. Now, you'll have your own biases, you'll have your own previous ideas, and some buckets of literature will be more interesting to you than others, but you go into that literature and you come up with a conceptual framework which may be an organisation of that literature. It might be quite vague, it may not be very well worked out, but you'll have a sort of set of things from the literature that you think are important. And then you bring that together with your ontology and your epistemology to form your theoretical framework. And I'll come on a bit in a bit to how tight or loose does that need to be, and the answer is not tight at all necessarily. And then you use that to determine your research questions, to determine your methods, to determine what you do. And then you use it to interpret your findings, and you use it to come up with your discussion and your conclusions. I'll come back to what I think is missing from that. And so one of the things I often say to my PhD students is a theoretical framework is whatever works for you. There is no right way to do a theoretical framework. It's usually underpinned by some ontology and epistemology. It's got something in there about what matters to you. And so just to give you an example, so Sharon, who's one of my colleagues who's in the room, was leading a project on skill mix change in primary care. And when we came to submit that application to HS&DR, we started thinking about theory. What theory are we interested in? So we started thinking about, well, skill mix change, different professions. Well, probably professional boundaries might be interesting. So we started looking at the literature on professional boundaries. We then also thought, well, hang on a minute. If you've got multiple different types of professional, you've got a GP practice, somebody's got to decide who the patient sees. Somebody's got to make a decision about where they go. So then we thought, well, actually, that's the organisational literature, that's the organisational routines literature. That might be interesting. So we had these buckets of literature that we were interested in. We were interested in professional boundaries, we were interested in organisational routines. We had our underlying ontology and epistemology, which luckily for the team was shared, which actually is a point to make. Is actually when you're doing big projects, it's worth sitting down together at the beginning and just saying, what's our ontology and epistemology, just so you know that you're not working at odds with one another. And then that determined what we did, because, so for example, because we were interested in organisational routines, one of the things we did was ethnography, where we hung about in reception areas to see what the routines were. We wanted to go beyond the written down routines. We wanted to see how those routines were operationalised in practice. But that was determined, what we did in the study was determined by those buckets of literature plus the ontology and epistemology that we had thought we were going to do. So it can be as vague as that the buckets of literature I'm interested in. This is another example from one of my projects. Some of you may know we evaluated the Vanguard programme, NHS England's programme of service change pilots. It was a very big programme. £250 million was spent on the Vanguards, which is a lot. And we were asked to evaluate it. And we could have evaluated it in a relatively straightforward way. We could have said, the Vanguard set out to do this. This is what they achieved. Did they achieve what they said they were going to do, and why? But because I come from a policy background, because the Vanguards were very big and very political, actually we thought we came at it from a more policy perspective. And so the buckets of literature that we were interested in were policy piloting, and there's a nice literature on that. Nick Mays and others have written about the purposes of policy, Stephanie Etelt, the purposes of policy piloting. Why do governments and systems pilot things? It's not always just to test whether they work or not. That's a hint. And then secondly, there's a whole literature on what constitutes policy success. Quick anecdote about that one. So you're probably not, some of you are not old enough to remember, but the Dangerous Dogs Act is always rolled out as whether or not a policy is effective. So dangerous dogs, a particular breed of dog was mauling small children. The tabloids got very upset. Politicians rushed out the Dangerous Dogs Act. And from a legal perspective, from a policy perspective, the Dangerous Dogs Act is a complete waste of space. It's hardly ever been used, hardly ever actually made any difference to anything in practice. However, politically, it was a massive success because it got the tabloids off the back of the government. So it was a very successful policy from a particular perspective. So what we did with this project was we brought together the literature on policy pilots and the literature on what constitutes policy success. And essentially what we concluded was we produced a new framework for how you might think about what constitutes policy pilot success. And our conclusion was that the Vanguards didn't do what they said they were going to do at all, but they were politically very successful because they underpinned Simon Stevens' bid to the Treasury for an extra 10 million quid for the NHS. So they were 10 billion, yes. So they were very successful from a political perspective, even though actually when you drill down to what did each individual Vanguard achieve, it was not a lot. So look at your background literature, think about the frameworks and the theoretical ideas that exist, think about how much they're applicable to your topic or not, and then think about, okay, what does this mean for my design and methods? The thing that I think is missing is the feedback loop. Because I'm indebted to my wonderful PhD student, Adjua, for this slide, which is lifted out of her PhD thesis. You're almost always, with theory, you're in what we call a hermeneutic circle. And what that basically means is you just go round and round and round. You start with some theoretical ideas, you apply them to your situation in context, you then use the information from the context to modify your theory, you then go back to the situation, and often you go around that loop multiple times. And at some point you have to decide to stop and get kicked out the side to come up with some findings. But often you could go round and round and round again. But you almost never just have a theory and just apply it. There's always this sort of interplay between the theory, the practice, the theory, the practice, and you go backwards and forwards between the two until you come up with something that you think you've modified your theory. And the lovely thing about this is you get two outputs, because you get your findings and then you get your paper about your theory. And that's really important, because if you publish stuff about your theory, then someone else can pick it up and use it. And that's how we build knowledge. So I think that this diagram needs a feedback loop, that you need to go from findings to theoretical framework and back to findings and back and round and round and round again. Just quickly, explanatory theory, I think this is a special case, I think. So the example I've put up there is the COM-B model of behaviour change. The other one that many of you will be familiar with, I think, is normalization process theory. So Carl May and his colleagues were researching implementation. They had a loose theoretical framework. They had some ideas. They had some things that they thought were relevant to whether or not implementation became sustained and normalized. And then they took that into the field. They did lots of research. They modified their theories. They went back to the field. And they came out with a very well worked out theory of normalization process theory. That theory has been tested very, very widely. And it's been used in multiple different contexts. And it's become a theory. It's been codified in many different ways with questionnaires and survey instruments, etc. And it's become something that it's an explanatory theory as to whether or not a particular intervention becomes normalized. You can take it, you can use it, you can apply it, and then you can use it to ask the question, why has my thing not been normalized or whatever. COM-B, very similarly, it's a set of theories about the factors which affect behaviour change. It's well worked out. This is a particular paper that somebody's done the hard yards of looking at acceptability, reliability, and validity of measures that reflect COM-B. So it's an explanatory theory for behaviour change. And what's good about it is that you can apply it. So, for example, you could apply COM-B to behaviour change in diabetes research. So, why do people change their behaviour in response to an intervention? And then someone else could use it in smoking cessation or in some other behaviour change field. And then you can make comparisons because you can say, well, these are the constructs of COM-B that apply here. These are the ones that are most important here. And then you can draw back from that and abstract and come up with some more general theories about what influences behaviour, how we need to think about behaviour change. And so I think explanatory theories, I think of them as a special case of a wider theoretical framework. And if in your particular field, your particular topic area, there is an explanatory theory, grab it with both hands because it's going to be really useful to you. You might be developing one yourself. That's the other thing, is that, Carl May started with a broad theoretical framework and came up with an explanatory theory. And that can be a very valuable and useful thing to do. And it's a good route to citations, I have to say. So what does theory do? So theory, and I think this is one of the things I wanted to emphasize, it's an explicit lens through which you look at the research situation. And that's really important because people who don't know a lot about qualitative research sometimes just say, well, it's just a description of what's going on out there. If you're explicit about the theoretical ideas that you're engaging with, somebody else can challenge you. They can engage with you. They can say, actually, I'm not sure that theoretical idea applies here, or I'm not, and you can have a dialogue. If you're not explicit about your underlying theories, then nobody can really engage with what you do. And I always think of it, I think of it as the scaffold that the study's built on. And sometimes I think of it as a series of hooks. Sometimes I think of it as a sort of loose framework. But it's something that you can use it to organize your ideas. Well, that fits in that box. That fits in that box. And if you don't have one, you don't have any boxes. And then it gets really messy. And this is the other thing. I think it's really important that you have a theoretical framework whether you think you do or not. So even if, and I know the grounded theorists are going to come after me on this one, but I firmly believe this, that even if you think you're a completely blank slate, there will be something that you are applying to the situation. It might be your personal experience. It might be something that you've heard, or it might be the odd paper that you've read at some point. But there will be something underlying, and we owe it to ourselves and our readers to be explicit, to interrogate ourselves and say, what are the theories that I'm relying on here? What's my theory about what might be going on here? Because if you don't, then it will be invisible and it can't be discussed and challenged. And then the final thing, and this is where we come back to the BMJ, theory is what allows us to generalize. Without theory, we cannot generalize. And I think that really matters. So just an example. So I've given you the example of the policy pilot success, starting with theories of policy piloting, success in policy. That's applicable to any policy piloting situation. That theory, the framework that we developed under which, so basically we took a framework for policy success and we adapted it for piloting, which took account of the multiple purposes of piloting. We produced a framework, we published it in public admin because it allows 9,000 words. We'll come back to that one. And it's been widely cited in lots of different policy. It's been cited in climate science. It's been cited in other policy areas because we've moved beyond the specific situation of the NHS, and we've produced something which can be generalised and thought about in other situations. I think there are problems with our framework, and I think it could be adapted and modified because I think we didn't take account of time. Because there is a big question with policy. At what point do you judge whether or not a policy is a success? And actually, I read a paper yesterday that was making exactly that point, that the point in time at which you judge a policy actually will affect whether or not it's seen as a success or not. So I think we missed that. That's something we need that could. So ideally, someone else will take my framework and adapt it and add in time in some way, shape, or form. You might, as I gave the example with COM-B, you might have an account of behaviour change in a particular context. Somebody has one in another context. You can take those two things together and you can abstract and you can start to generalise about behaviour change. To give the example from Adjoa, my PhD student, she was looking at primary care networks in Ghana. She started with a framework that had been produced, actually I think it was published in the BMJ Open, I think. But it was an evaluation framework for healthcare networks. She applied it to primary care networks in Ghana. She went, but it didn't quite fit. She went back and modified it. She went back into the field. She modified it again. And so out of her PhD, she's got some findings about primary care networks in Ghana, which are important and interesting. But she's also got a modified evaluation framework, which can then be applied by others and which can be used to make comparisons between Ghana and other situations, other types of healthcare networks, cancer networks, for example. So in summary, themes never emerge. You generate themes based on and very often it's very personal. One of the things that I didn't mention earlier when thinking about ontology and epistemology is how you think about, sort of what constitutes sort of the right way to do things. So if you talk to a positivist and they're talking about qualitative coding, they'll tell you that you need 2 or 3 coders who can then sort of compare and come up with the correct coding. If you talk to a constructivist, they'll say you might well want 2 or 3 coders, but it's not about finding the correct coding. Actually, multiple ways. Any given bit of qualitative data can be coded in multiple ways. And actually, if you have multiple coders and they come up with multiple different codes, what you then end up with is an incredibly rich conversation about where are we coming from with this data, what's it telling us. And I think that's really important and that's another reason why you've got to be explicit at the beginning. Am I a positivist who thinks that that there's a truth, there's a correct coding here? Or am I a constructivist where I think actually it's about the richness of the conversation? It's really important that your readers know what lens you're coming from. And I think that's one of the things I'm going to come on to just very briefly to finish. And of course, theory is the thing which allows us to generalize. Without theory, all we're doing is describing a particular situation in the world. That might be really interesting, and it might be particularly interesting for the people affected by that situation. But the BMJ is right. Unless we engage with theory, we can't generalize. So this is my second most highly cited paper, which happens to be a qualitative paper that was published in the BMJ in 2007 with my lovely colleague Ruth MacDonald, who was from an organisational studies background. And for that study, we used 2 buckets, if you like, of literature and theory. We looked at clinical autonomy and we looked at internal motivation, and we were looking at QOF. And we looked at clinical autonomy and internal motivation, and we did an ethnography in 2 practices. in the northwest of England, and we managed to get a paper in the BMJ out of it, which has been very highly cited, which gives a lie to the BMJ, the BMJ idea that things don't get cited. The median citation count apparently is 12. Ours is 270. But no, we can't publish qualitative research because it doesn't get cited. Just quickly, implications for publishers, because this is a publishing conference. Quality checklists are a nightmare. Please ditch COREC, in particular. And the reason for that is because they don't really engage with theory. If you go down the COREC, I mean, I don't know how many constructs it's got in it, about 30 probably, 20 or 30, and one of them says, what's the theoretical framework? Now, when I'm judging the quality of a qualitative paper, I don't just want to know what the theoretical framework was. I want to know how that applies through everything. I want to know how does that apply to how does that feed through into their findings? How does it feed through into their discussion? How did it structure what they did at the beginning? And I'm far more interested in that than I am in the details of who they interviewed and how and whatever. And I think that the problem with quality checklists is that we lose sight of that broader feeling, actually. I mean, you know, there's a good literature on GP gut feelings, which shows that GP gut feelings are actually incredibly valuable in working out what's going on. And I think researcher gut feelings are very important too. And I think quality checklists take us away from, and we end up with using words to describe endless things that are on the correct checklist, when actually what I want to know as a reader is, what's the theory here? What are people talking about, and how have they gone about linking their findings to their theory? And obviously, theory takes words. So most of what I would describe as my best papers, or my most theoretically informed papers, have been published in sociology journals, policy journals, which allow 9,000 words. Because in order to do justice, to really set out the theories, really explain them, and then apply them judiciously and carefully to your findings and discuss them at the end, takes a lot of words. And I think we do ourselves a disservice, because I think one of the reasons why the BMJ doesn't want to publish qualitative research is because, I mean, I don't even know whether they have a word count or what their word count is, but because we're so conditioned to try and keep things short that we don't describe our theory properly, and therefore our papers do look as if they're not generalizable, because we're not giving them the information they need to see what's generalizable or not. Thank you.